Is it possible to zero your deer rifle at 30 yards and be good to go for the season? Well, possibly. We're going to explain how on this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. Hi everyone, I have got a Mossberg Patriot Predator rifle here that I'm going to be using on a hunt next week, so I need to get it zeroed. I put a new scope on it, got a nice loophole up here. We just got down bore sighting it, and we're going to see if we can't shoot that 30-yard target. I put a box out there at 30 yards. That's not my normal zeroing distance. We're just going to see if we can do this. If you zero at 30 yards, will you be good for 100, 200? What distances will you be good to hit your deer? We hope to find out. This is a 6.5 PRC, 130 grain bullet, terminal ascent from Federal, and we'll see how close we got on our bore sighting. All right, we are about 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch to the right. If you do this, don't say close enough. That might be close enough out there at 100 or 200 yards, but you have got to be precise when you're close like this. So mark that down, be precise. So what I'm going to do now is return to my aiming point and then turn to my bullet hole. And I moved my rifle a little bit, but it looked like I got there. You can also count your clicks, but of course they're not going to be a quarter click. That's 100-yard business. Quarter click moves it 1/4 of an inch at 100 yards. At 30 yards, come on, man, do the math. I have a central silencer on this, which reduces the noise nicely. And also the recoil. Yes, it moved a little bit, so now I'm about a 1/2 inch to the left. So I'm going to see if I can't lock this rifle down nicely on that zero and not move it this time. To do this, you really need to have some help. You've got to lock that rifle down, either some big sandbags or have an assistant hold it down so it doesn't move while you turn. I'm just not pulling it off myself, so we'll see how close we come on this one. Ideally, you could save a lot of ammo if you do it with that technique, and we've covered it in another episode. But the key is locking that rifle down when you're making the moves. You just turn the crosshair until it covers your last bullet hole. And I don't think I'm going to have achieved it on this one either. Pretty close, just a little bit low. So I think I'm about ready. Take this baby up. 4 clicks, even at 30 yards, but at 25 yards, 4 clicks would equal 1/4 of an inch move. And that's about what I need to move, so I think we're pretty close. I will try one more. Burn up all this wonderful ammunition. Guy hates to do that in this day and age, doesn't he? There it is. Red dot. Got it. Finally. So we're zeroed for 30 yards. What we want to find out now is what happens at 100 yards. So we're going to set up for a 100-yard target. But the key to knowing all of this and making it work is a ballistics calculator. We're going to get into that later in the show. But if you've got access to a chronograph, you need to use it. These things are supposed to be going 3,000 feet per second according to the box, and we just got 3,037 feet per second. So pretty close. I would imagine another bullet could easily go a little less than that, a little more than that, but we're getting in the general ballpark now. And that's the number we need to run our ballistic tables. Let's see now. We'll set up for 100 yards and see what we're doing out there. Okay, we have the rifle chronograph set up for a 100-yard target now. We were dead zeroed at 30 yards. Let's see how high we land at 100 yards. Will we be good to take a deer at 100? I'm even going to crank this scope up. Way up there to 15, I can really be precise. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, we need to go down there and see that 100-yard target, because you are going to be surprised. Well, this is what happened. We were dead zero to 30 yards, and at 100 yards, I was aiming at center, so we're up 1, 2, 3, 4.25 inches. Little bit high, don't you think? Now, some people will zero that high at 100 yards, but I sure don't recommend it. It's just way too easy to shoot over your animal. We've got to look at the numbers, and the easiest way to do this is with a ballistics calculator. Let us go up to the studio and consult one and see where we should really be zeroing based on several things: velocity, ballistics coefficient of the bullet, and how high your sight sits above your bore. Those are all critical ingredients. Okay, let's figure this stuff out. If you want to zero your rifle at a short distance because you just don't have a range that lets you get out there, you can do it at 25 yards or 30 yards or 35 yards, but you cannot just as a blanket statement say zero at 30 yards and you're good at 100 to 200 or whatever you're imagining, because it changes, and it's due to the velocity of your cartridge, your bullet, the ballistic efficiency of your bullet, we call that ballistic coefficient, and the sight of your rifle, the height of it. If it is higher or lower, that will make a difference in where your bullets end up downrange with that 30-yard zero. And it's complicated to do a 30-yard zero because the scope adjustments are for 100 yards, and you can equate that to 50, 25, 200 if you know how to run all that stuff. So the basics are like this. Most scopes are set up for minute of angle, and they will click at 1/4 MOA, but that amounts to 1/4 of an inch at 100 yards. So if you're zeroing at 100, it's easy to say, I need to move an inch up by clicking 4 times, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, you've got an inch. But at 30 yards, at 25 yards, it's quadrupled. So 4 clicks at 20 yards amounts to 1/4 of an inch at 25 yards. At 30, obviously, it's a little bit different. But I think you can pretty closely use your 1/4 clicks for 25 yards by taking them times 4. So figure 4 clicks are going to move it 1/4 of an inch at 25 yards, and roughly the same at 30. You'll have to do a little bit of tweaking. One of the ways that we can zero at closer ranges, of course, is to shoot at the target, note where the bullet hole is, align your rifle and sights without adjusting anything on the scope, right back at the bullseye where you were aiming when you took the shot. Keep that rifle from moving, dial your scope until the crosshair moves over to the bullet hole. Then the barrel, the sights are looking at the same place. That one's a little bit tricky to do because you've got to really lock that rifle down. You can't wiggle it even a little bit and then it's off and you can't tell if the crosshair is moving or the rifle moved over. So those are your 2 ways to get the job done. But before you do that, you should go with a ballistics calculator to give you a good idea of the kind of trajectories you're going to get with these different sight-in distances. And it's really a lot easier than a lot of people imagine, and it's free. You can go online. I can recommend at least 3 different free calculators online. One of them is shooterscalculator.com. Another one is JBM Calculator, or what is it? Ballistic Calculator. I wrote it down. JBMBallistics.com. And the last one is Hornady's, and they've got 2 of them on their site. You can just go to Hornady.com and look up ballistic calculators because their actual address there is quite long. Hornady.com/team-Hornady-ballistic dash calculators /# exclamation point / just go to Hornady.com and let it roll. Now, I did this for this 6.5 PRC that I was shooting. I wanted to see roughly what to expect. So I ran some numbers on Shooters Calculator, the shooters.com, shooterscalculator.com. And I ran it for a 6.5 PRC rifle. That's the one I was out there shooting, with the scope setting 2 inches above the bore. And that's what mine is. And you can measure that with the standard ruler or tape measure or something. You just find roughly, just get broadside to it and see, okay, there's the center of the barrel. There is roughly the center of the scope. What's the span? And that's how you determine that one. Most scopes are around 1.5 to 1.75, 1 3/4 inches above. But some of the big tall ones, you're going to get up there to 2 inches, and it makes a difference. Now let's just find out what kind of a difference it's going to make. So first of all, I took the information off the box of my ammunition, hoping that it was accurate. And they're fairly close these days. I'm kind of impressed with things. This one says that I should be getting 3,000 feet per second velocity. So that's what I used for my number. It also gave me the BC number of my bullet, 0.532. I put that into the calculator, and I ran those numbers with the scope 2 inches high on a 30-yard target. So what I came up with was at 30 yards, obviously I'm dead on, but at 100 yards, I was going to be 3.18 inches high. So figure 3 inches high at 100. Not bad. I can live with that. But look what happens out at 150 yards, 4.16 inches up. Starting to get a little bit high here. We might shoot high over our target. And it's even higher at 175 yards at 4.2. So 4.25 inches up at 175 yards. Yeah, that might be a little bit too much. So what happens if I change my 0 to 25 yards? Everything else remains the same. So now I'm 4.39 inches high already at 100 yards, and at 175 yards, I'm 6.33 inches high. That is ridiculous. So 25 yards zero is not going to work. And some folks have told me they zero at 25 yards because that ought to be good out to at least 200. No. So another option then I took was 35 yard zero. Now look at the numbers. I'm 2.35, so roughly 2.25 inches high at 100 yards. And at 150, I'm peaking at 2.91. So I'm still 3 inches under. That gives me a maximum point blank range of a 6-inch target, which is good and safe. Going to work just fine for deer and elk, everything else. So you never fly any higher than 3 inches with that zero. So 35 yard zero with this particular load is ideal, and that's what I should be using. And then when I tested it out there, sure enough, when I zeroed at 30 and took my 100-yard shot, I was a good 4.5 inches high. And when I then re-zeroed at 35 yards, I was only 2.25 inches above my aim point at 100 yards. That I can live with. Okay, this scope is sitting about 2 inches above bore line. Higher than I want it to be, but I didn't have any other rings to work with how to get this thing rolling. And that is having an impact on this high shot at 100 yards. But so is the distance of my zero. Instead of 30 yards, now I've moved my box just 5 yards further back, 35 yards. Based on what I was checking out on the ballistics calculators, this should probably work. We're going to reduce the elevation at 100 yards by zeroing at 35. So let me shift things over and get a 35-yard zero for you guys. I'm going to be shooting at the upper left little diamond on this one. I have really no idea where this first bullet is going to land because I've left my settings the same as they were for the 30-yard zero. Boy, I'm probably 1/4 inch higher, if that. I'd better try another shot. This just doesn't seem to change anything. Alas, burning ammunition. Smidgen higher. Okay, let's take it down. Okay, I adjusted my sights. I'm going to aim now at the upper right. Bingo. All right, now let's see what happens at 100 yards because we are on at 35. Well, let's see what we can do at 100. Oh, looks like it came down 1, 2, 3 inches. Let's run it back out there and see, folks. Made a big difference just changing it up to 5 yards. We'll go take a look. Hey, there we go. Came down. First one from the 30-yard side in, 35-yard side in. What a difference 5 yards makes. Brought it down 1, 2.25 inches. So aiming at our 100-yard target, we're 1-2 inches high. Pretty nice for a lot of folks set up for deer. That extends your maximum point blank range, getting closer to 275 yards or so. But again, it all depends on the bullet, how fast it's going, what its ballistics coefficient number is, and how high above your bore your scope sets. So that is how you can zero for 30 yards, 25 yards, or any short distance. Just run it through the ballistics calculator first. Now, just to show you what could happen, I want to go with a scope setting that's different. And this one is going to be 1.5 inches of scope height. I'm going to go back to that 30-yard zero, and I just want to compare it to the first 30-yard zero when I used the 2-inch high scope. So you remember the 2-inch high scope was showing 3.18 inches height at 100 yards with the scope only 1.5 inches above my bore. It's only 2 inches at 100 yards. And my peak trajectory out there at 150 yards is only, well, it's 125 yards. On this one, it's 2.25 inches. So if I had my scope sitting lower, I could have used a 30-yard zero. Once again, it's why important to know all this stuff before you just start banging out your zeros at 30 yards, figuring you're going to be good. Now, what will happen with different rifles, different cartridges, different ballistics coefficients, and all the rest? I ran some numbers on a 30-30 using a 170 grain bullet. The ballistics coefficient of that bullet was pretty reasonable for that particular one, 0.252. It's not real high, but in the 30-30s, you usually don't get a very high one. But this was a Nosler partition bullet, which is a little bit pointed, but not so sharply pointed that it's going to be any kind of a danger in a 30-30 in a tubular magazine, where you might get the slam fires from the sharply tipped bullets hitting the primer. That's the theory anyway. So that's why you usually have a flat-nosed bullet in the 30-30. The partition's kind of a compromise, that soft lead and gently rounded. At any rate, I used that one. And I had a 1.5 inch sight height because I measured it on my Henry 30-30. It's just a standard post front sight, not a scope. And it actually sits, the top of that post is 1.5 inches above the center of the bore line. So that's what I used for my sight height. Did the 30-yard zero idea. And the result of that was I was peaking my trajectory at about 75 yards at 0.81, so less than an inch above my aiming point. And then at 125 yards, I was a half inch low. At 150 yards, 2.25 inches low. So I'm pretty well set for a 30-30 shooting at deer with that 170 grain bullet out to about 150 yards with a dead on hold. At 200 yards, it's dropping almost 8 inches, so that's a little bit excessive. But if you know your drops, of course, you can aim high. And with open sights, in my eyes at any rate, I'm probably not going past 150 yards anyway. So for those of you who are looking to zero your 30-30, and I think most standard 30-30s are going to have that roughly 1.5 inch height of their front post sight above the bore, you can probably get by with this 30-yard zero. Now, what happens if you've got an older 30-30 when the sights are a bit lower? Let's say 1 inch. Kind of a change is that going to make? Well, now at the peak trajectory is, it's almost nothing really. I'm seeing 1/4 inch at 50 yards. It might be a little more or a little less at 40 or 60 or something, but it's shooting pretty much dead flat out to about 100 yards where it's about 3/4 inches of drop. It's minus 0.70. So that's roughly 3/4 inch drop at 100. And then at 150, well, you're down to 4. So it's not as good of a zero, I don't think, for getting a little more reach out of that. You don't have to be dead on and then only 1/4 inch difference at 50 yards. You can afford to shoot a little bit higher. And that's what you get with this higher sight height. So you can play around with numbers like that. You can change the velocity. You can go with a 150 grain bullet and your velocity is going to change. And you'll end up with perhaps a better option to zero that rifle at 35 yards. But you need to play around. And that's the nice thing about these computers. You can do all of that without wasting your ammunition. You don't have to shoot and shoot and shoot and make adjustments and see what's happening. The ballistics calculator will tell you, and they are surprisingly close, as I found out with my 6.5. I just assumed, all right, I'm going to be getting 3,000 feet per second because that's what it says on the box.
I know those aren't exact, but it's pretty close. So I'll just run those numbers and get a feel for it. And it told me that the 30-yard zero was probably going to shoot too high, and it did. When I ran it with the 35-yard zero, said it was going to be a lot better, and it's exactly what it did. Even though my actual measured velocity with my chronograph out front was 50 feet per second faster. The average was 3,050 feet per second. So again, those are all the variables you just can't predict. But boy, it just makes it a lot easier when you've got your numbers rather than having to just keep shooting and then measuring your distances. Now, what happens if your velocity changes? You've still got your sight height the same, your bullet BC is the same, you're shooting at the same distance, you're zero at 30 yards. But what happens if your bullet is not going the speed that it says on the box of your ammo or what you assumed it was going? I actually ended up with 50 feet per second average faster velocity than the book said. So I went back into the calculator and I ran my numbers using 3,050 feet per second muzzle velocity instead of the 3,000 I started with the first time. And there was not that big of a change, but there was a change. So at 100 yards, you remember with the 3,000 foot per second velocity, it was 3.18 inches high at 100. And with the 50 feet per second difference, now it's only 2.39 inches. So there's a little bit of difference right there. The important thing is what happens farther down range. Are we going to go considerably higher or lower and miss our target? At 150 yards, we were 4.16 inches high with the 3,000 feet per second velocity, but we were only 3.02 inches high at 150 yards with the 50 feet per second faster velocity. So a little bit different there, an inch, a little bit less than an inch. So not a huge difference. The maximum trajectory, the peak of it was 3.97 at 200 yards with the 30-yard zero at 3,000 feet per second. But it was only 3 inches high at 150 yards for the peak trajectory with the 3,050 foot per second. So you get a little bit of change by changing your velocities. Pay attention to that as well. So I think that's the best advice I can give you for zeroing your rifle at a range where you just can't reach out to 100 yards. Ideally, you should double check these by shooting farther when you do get somewhere where you can. But if you're in a pinch, you're in a hurry, I think you run those ballistics calculations. Use either a good reading with your chronograph. If you don't have one of those, you can just take the information off your box or go with kind of get a general idea of what your particular cartridge usually shoots in that length of barrel, and then measure that sight height and try to find the BC of your bullet, run all that information through the mill, and you should come up with a pretty good distance at which to zero your rifle for deer season. Hope it all works for you guys. Best of luck. Until next time, this is Ron Spomer, Hunt Honest and Shoot Straight.